Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, the Director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to a discussion of alliances and nuclear risk, evidence from the Cold War, implications for today, and to welcome back both Doctors Caitlin Talmadge and Brendan Green, who have been with us on previous occasions. Before turning it over to them, let me say just a few brief words to help set the context. As many of you will know, CGSR has made it a priority to understand the nature of modern strategic conflict, especially those aspects of wars in Europe or Northeast Asia that would have multi-domain escalation risk. Our most recent workshop, for example, conducted just last week, focused on the particular challenges of de-escalation and war termination in such conflicts. Our work in this area has brought home to us with discouraging frequency and continuity both the urgency of the need for new strategic thought on these questions and the near absence of focus and bandwidth that has impaired more rapid progress up the learning curve. The center has also made it a priority to understand the perspectives, interests, and capabilities of U.S. allies, and to make them full partners in our efforts to develop new strategic thought on these questions. And I would say they've not only been willing, but eager. Moreover, some of them have emerged as genuine thought leaders in this area, which in my view is a natural result of the sense of urgency, if not actual anxiety that they feel about their security environments. Our two speakers today have put together these two topics in a novel and useful way. The two topics being the nature of modern strategic conflict and the interest and roles of allies and alliances. And their work has generated important new insights into deterrence, assurance, and strategic stability in the new security environment. And I'll leave it to the two of them to explain their research question and analytic approach. Dr. Caitlin Talmadge is an associate professor of security studies in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She's also a senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. She's the author of an award-winning book entitled The Dictator's Army, Battlefield Effectiveness in Authoritarian Regimes, published by Cornell University Press. She has a bachelor's in government from Harvard and a PhD in political science from MIT. Dr. Brendan Green is an associate professor of political science at the University of Cincinnati. His most recent publication is a Cambridge University Press book entitled The Revolution That Failed: Nuclear Competition, Arms Control, and the Cold War. He has a bachelor's in political science from the University of Chicago and also a PhD in political science from MIT. Before I turn it over to the two of you, let me review with the group the rules of engagement this morning. Dr. Talmadge will present for approximately 45 minutes their main arguments and background on their work. And then we'll engage in roughly 45 minutes of roundtable discussion. If you would like to join that discussion, and I hope you will, please raise your hand electronically. If you'd prefer, just send me a chat and I'll try and put the point into play at an appropriate moment. Thanks so much, Caitlin and Brendan, for making the time to join us on this. Thank you for your leadership in this work. Let me turn it over to you, Caitlin.
Great. Thank you so much, Brad. Thank you for the introduction and, of course, the opportunity for Brendan and me to present some of our work here. We are big fans of the center, have followed the work from this group, and especially from you, Brad, of course, for many years. And so it's exciting to be here and get some feedback on work in progress that we've been conducting. I'm going to put the slides up here, and hopefully everyone can see them. If you can't, give a shout out so that we know that. As Brad mentioned, we are talking today about some of our ongoing research on alliances and nuclear escalation risk, looking at evidence from the Cold War and implications for today. And I'm going to, in the interest of just keeping things technically simple, do our slides, do the main presentation of our joint research project, and then Brendan and I will both join in for the Q&A and the discussion with all of you, and looking forward to your thoughts. So as we indicated, we're looking in this project at the connection between alliance commitments and the potential for nuclear escalation risk, which are two topics that we know, I think intuitively, for those of us who work in the field of international security, are very much at the forefront of a lot of issues that we all deal with, read about, think about, although the connections between the two are not always as explicit, perhaps, or as rigorously made as might be helpful. So we know, for instance, in reading documents like the Nuclear Posture Review, that US nuclear posture is almost always situated in the context of extended deterrence commitments to alliances, which clearly implies a connection between nuclear posture and alliance commitments. And likewise, in documents and public statements on regional strategies and the importance of alliances, those relationships are always discussed against the backdrop of the US nuclear umbrella. So we know these two things are connected. The question is, how exactly are they connected? Sometimes we actually see evidence that these two objectives or these two issues can be in tension with each other. If you look, for example, at the most recent interim national security strategic guidance that came out from the Biden administration just a couple months ago, you can get a little bit of a sense of this when the two issues are discussed within sentences of each other within the same paragraph. We hear this document on the one hand promise that the United States is going to head off a costly arms race, reestablish its leadership in arms control, take steps to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in US national security strategy. And then in the same breath, we hear the document also emphasizing that the US has to make sure that its strategic deterrent, of course, remains effective, remains credible, and remains strong in the extended deterrence role of putting that nuclear umbrella over allies. And so there's a hint there that there's some tension between arms control, risk reduction, reducing nuclear escalation dangers, and on the other hand, having a strong enough nuclear deterrent that allies perceive it to be credible, and of course, adversaries as well. And this is not a new tension. If we look at the history of strategic nuclear policy, many of you may have seen this article in the New York Times just within the last 10 days, examining the risk of potential US nuclear escalation over Taiwan in the 1958 crisis, when the US seriously worried about the possibility that it might not be able to defend Taiwan conventionally, and that because of the need to maintain its commitment to Taiwan, which of course was very robust during this period, the United States considered turning to nuclear weapons, including nuclear strikes on mainland China. Obviously, a different context in many ways. China didn't have nuclear weapons at the time, but nevertheless points back to this enduring connection and this tension between US nuclear weapons policy and US alliance commitments. And that is really what we want to zero in on in the question we look at in this research project. In this research project, the main question we examine is, do asymmetric alliance commitments increase escalation risk? And if so, under what conditions and through what mechanisms? And when we use this term asymmetric alliance commitments, what we mean is an alliance commitment between a great power and a weaker state. So not a peer-to-peer alliance relationship like the type the great powers formed on the eve of World War I, but rather a situation in which one of the alliance partners is clearly providing security to a weaker alliance partner in exchange not for mutual defense protection, but for that smaller power's concurrence with the great power's larger foreign policy goals. And so our question is, do those types of asymmetric alliance commitments from great powers to client states increase escalation risk? And by escalation risk, we are generally thinking about it in the Schelling-esque way, meaning an increase in the scope or intensity of conflict past some threshold that's considered meaningful to one or more of the participants. So there are important conventional escalation thresholds. There is an important threshold between conventional and nuclear, and then there are others within the nuclear realm as well. So we're thinking about escalation in that way and wondering if asymmetric alliance commitments make that more likely. The general wisdom, the conventional wisdom that comes out of most research on this question is no, Alliances actually don't increase risks. Alliances, particularly asymmetric alliances, in which by definition one party is a lot more powerful than the other, generally advance the interests of the stronger party with very few risks. There's a great deal of research that suggests alliances don't cause wars, even though states that are in alliances may fight wars. The alliance commitments don't cause the initiation of conflict. There's several studies that specifically point to the problem of great power entrapment being very rare, that it's really hard for small allies to get great powers to do things that they don't want to do, drag them into wars that they don't want to fight. Powerful states in particular wield important bargaining advantages when they're negotiating things like military policy with their weaker clients. And there's a great deal of research on this suggesting that, again, power is what enables the stronger state to dominate inter-alliance bargaining. And several studies have looked at this particularly within the context of extended deterrence guarantees, so nuclear alliances. And again, the results generally are said to apply. Alliance commitments, they don't cause wars. We, of course, are looking at a slightly different question than whether alliances actually cause conflicts. We're looking at the question of when states get into conflicts, are those conflicts more likely to escalate because of certain decisions that the great power makes in the context of alliance commitments? So it's a little bit different from looking at conflict initiation, which is what most of the existing research has done. We're actually looking at conflict escalation. Do alliance commitments increase escalation risk? And if so, what makes that more or less likely? And in order to look at this question, which we think has a lot of implications for the present day and for the future, which we'll talk about towards the latter half of the presentation, we actually look at some historical evidence from what we think is a really important and in many ways understudied episode from the Cold War that has a lot of relevance for current security issues. And that is NATO's 1979 dual track decision, which many in this audience are probably familiar with. This was NATO's decision to deploy 108 Pershing II intermediate range nuclear tipped ballistic missiles and 464 Griffin ground launched cruise missiles in Italy and West Germany. The decision was made in 79. They deploy a bit later, while at the same time pursuing with the Soviet Union strategic arms control negotiations over this same class of theater nuclear forces. And this class of missiles, of course, is the one that ultimately is banned by the INF Treaty in 1987, which of course people in this room know has recently foundered and is no longer in effect. But the dual track decision was the decision to deploy these missiles while simultaneously pursuing arms control negotiations over this class of missiles with the Soviets, hence the name dual track. And we think that this is an important episode to look at in terms of alliance military policy and the potential for nuclear escalation risk for a couple of reasons. One is that the dual track decision was widely understood to be escalatory in the sense that I defined it a few moments ago. It was a class of missiles that was deployed with the express purpose, the understood purpose of being able to make credible threats of early coercive nuclear use against targets in the Soviet homeland. So these were missiles that were oriented toward the mission of nuclear warfighting and could engage in that mission after being launched from European soil rather than US soil, and which traditionally had been what was required to threaten those sorts of targets deep inside the Soviet Union. And what's interesting about this episode, as we'll talk about, is it's a case where the preferences of the weaker allies to deploy these missiles prevailed over those of the great power, the United States, which was not particularly interested in deploying these missiles. And in fact, as we'll talk about in a moment with some of the evidence that we've looked at, the US strongly preferred strengthening conventional defenses of NATO in this period, delaying nuclear use, not making it easier by deploying these types of missiles, and continuing arms control with the Soviet Union. But that's not actually what ends up happening. The missiles are deployed for some reasons we'll talk about, and we can look actually at the decision-making process that leads to this escalatory military policy through an extensive documentary record that's actually now available, which again is one of the reasons we think that this is a useful historical case to look at. And the general story that comes out of the evidence, and that we'll outline as we go along, is that for reasons of geography and politics and some other things we'll talk about, there were some really strong intra-alliance preference divergences with respect to the military policy in this period. In other words, NATO allies and the US disagreed about what the ideal level of escalatory risk in military policy should be in this period. And the disagreement became severe enough and salient enough that it actually started to undermine the political and the military cohesion of the alliance itself, and to undermine the reasons that the United States formed NATO in the first place. And these concerns over cohesion in the alliance, the possibility that the alliance might actually break apart because of disagreements about theater nuclear policy, leads the US, despite being the more powerful member of the alliance, to concede to its smaller allies' preferences and adopt their preference for a more escalatory military policy as embodied in the decision to deploy these missiles, as we talk about. As we'll talk about as we go on today. And we think this story is worth looking at because, as we'll point out, there are some similarities to the world that we find ourselves in today, not only in Europe, but really in Asia. The presence of alliance commitments and the need to respond in the security environment to a shifting nuclear and conventional balance create some parallels to the environment today. Of course, it's not a perfect parallel. There are important differences in alliance structure, NATO versus no NATO in Asia, the nature of a continental environment versus a maritime one. But nevertheless, we think that there are some lessons that can be drawn out of this episode and sharpen our thinking about policy. So what we'd like to do in the remainder of our presentation today is really just two main things. One is to discuss with you some of the evidence that we found on the 1979 dual track decision and what it can tell us about the relationship between asymmetric alliance commitments and nuclear escalation risk. And then secondly, we'd like to talk about what the broader implications are, both for theory development, for thinking about these problems generally, and also for policy more specifically, which is what we'll talk about at the end. So as we mentioned, one of the neat things about the dual track decision is we can actually learn a lot about it because it's old enough that there's a lot of declassified records. Back in the days of yore, when people could still get on airplanes and go to places, we hopped down to Atlanta to go to the Carter Presidential Library, spent about a week going through a bunch of documents down there, looked at hundreds of documents from the National Security Council and the Carter administration, state, defense, NATO, the ambassadors to Europe, and we've also scoped out secondary literature, foreign relations of the United States, and so forth, to get a clear sense of not just what happened with the dual track decision, but how and why it happened, and what that can teach us about intra-alliance bargaining in the context of extended deterrence commitments. And it is important to understand the context here in which the dual track decision came about. It was a situation in which trends in the military balance in Europe were really seen as strongly favoring the Soviets, who were undergoing a theater-wide conventional and nuclear force modernization process, exemplified in particular by the deployment of the nuclear IRBM, the SS-20, as well as the backfire bombers, which, both of which really concerned European allies who felt like the Soviets were kind of lapping them in terms of military technology and theater improvements that directly threatened them. And, this was happening in the 70s after a previous decade that had also been really rough on the alliance internally, politically, as the Allies bargained in a pretty brutal manner over what should replace massive retaliation, what culminated in the doctrine of flexible response, which really remained pretty vague. The agreement in flexible response was really, characterized by the slogan that NATO would use nuclear weapons as late as possible, but as early as necessary, which left a lot of wiggle room in there, but was basically the best the alliance could do to paper over its differences. But this got kind of even more difficult to do by the early 1970s, as the United States pursued arms control and détente with the Soviets. You might think, oh, this is something that would make the allies happy. Isn't arms control supposed to be stabilizing and so forth? But US allies in NATO didn't really see superpower arms control that way. What they saw was a situation in which SALT I and the ABM Treaty ratified strategic level parity between the superpowers, locked in mutual vulnerability at the level of strategic nuclear weapons, while leaving the Europeans relatively vulnerable to the theater-wide nuclear and also conventional force modernization that the Soviets were nevertheless pursuing. And as the NATO allies kind of looked down the pike at SALT II and another treaty called MBFR, which is the Mutual and Balanced Force Reductions, which would have limited American conventional forces and also some American tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, there was a lot of concern that the US was basically going to give up a lot of its theater capabilities, including long-range cruise missiles, without concomitant limits on Soviet capabilities, all of which kind of raised the possibility that the Soviets would attack Europe and the US would be kind of paralyzed because of the vulnerability of its homeland to Soviet strategic forces and its lack of symmetrical ability to respond within the theater. And so this is a context in which the European allies were pretty concerned, and this is the world that the Carter administration comes into in 1979, and they kind of have, or excuse me, in 1976, and they have to kind of decide, what are they going to do? What's their policy going to be? The initial preferences that come out of the US administration in this period are really to continue détente. They're pretty ambitious, continue strategic arms control. That's Carter's vision of the relationship with the Soviets. And there's little concern for the Allies that the Allies' anxieties that they've expressed, those kind of get a head pat, as we'll show you in a couple of moments with some of the documents. But it's basically like, Allies, don't worry, chill out. Carter is kind of forging ahead with a series of negotiations and policies that emphasize strengthening NATO's conventional defense, delaying the prospect of engaging in nuclear escalation, limiting NATO theater nuclear forces, and basically trying to de-emphasize the role of nuclear forces in the defense of NATO allies, and certainly not, there's not interest in deploying new intermediate range nuclear forces to Europe. That's not something that they're interested in doing. And you get a sense of this looking at early documents that come out of the Carter administration. This is one just from early 1977, where you see in this Pentagon report, kind of initially doing a security review, that the emphasis really needs to be conventional in our NATO policy, and the long-term US goals got to be to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons. Interesting choice of phrase. It's almost identical actually to the turn of phrase that I showed you in the Biden document at the beginning of the presentation. Got to wean our allies away from over-reliance on nuclear deterrence. We've got to generate higher confidence in conventional deterrence. And later that spring, an NSC report, really kind of relays the same set of preferences and expresses confidence that the European allies are going to go along with this. Basically, like, the US has done a great job handling SALT. We've paid full attention to Western European interests, and the constancy of the American commitment to NATO and to Europe's defense has credibility today. So, everything's hunky-dory. We're going to pursue strategic arms control. Everything's going to be, unicorns and rainbows with the allies. Everything's good. The view from Europe was a little bit different during this time. European allies had some very different preferences as they looked out at the security environment at the beginning of the Carter administration. There was really deep anxiety in European capitals about US nuclear credibility, precisely for the reason I outlined, that, like, hey, if you're in strategic parity if there's strategic parity between the US and the Soviets, how are you, the United States, actually going to credibly threaten the Soviets in the event that they attack us, particularly conventionally? Like, how do you have nuclear credibility? And there was a particular concern that the Carter administration in SALT II was going to negotiate away a permanent ban on long-range cruise missiles, exactly the type of theater nuclear capability that could have solved the problem I just mentioned a moment ago. So there's a lot of concern about this. And also during this period, there's a big controversy over the enhanced radiation weapon, the ERW, or the neutron bomb, which is not directly connected to this debate, but raises for a lot of European decision makers the salience of the nuclear issue during this period, and just really heightens fears about the possibility that the US is going to go off into the arms control sunset with the Soviets, and the Europeans are going to be left vulnerable. And so the Europeans, for their part, what they want to see is a strengthening of NATO nuclear forces, not negotiating those forces away. They want to see forces that can make credible threats of early coercive nuclear escalation, and particularly deep strikes on targets in the Soviet homeland launched from European soil. And to do that, they think, a good way to get there would be to deploy new long-range theater nuclear forces in Europe. And that's what they're actually pushing for, is exactly the type of weapons that eventually get deployed. And this divergence in preferences between the Europeans and the Americans really starts to dawn on the Americans in the first year of the Carter administration, where you start seeing cable traffic, for instance, coming back from the State Department after meetings with Europeans and NATO in early 1978, where the Germans are conveying that they're really concerned about where SALT II is going, that one element of the NATO triad is being treated in isolation, and it's posing risks for us. And the West shouldn't be giving up options which might be essential for our security. If the United States does that, there's the possibility that the Soviets may see reduced risks in possible action against Europe. In other words, the Soviets might try to engage in conventional or low-level nuclear aggression against Europe. And what are you really going to do about that? Because you're not going to launch US strategic nuclear weapons against the Soviets if that happens. And so this fear that the Europeans are expressing starts to kind of dawn on the Carter administration. There's another really important trip report that comes back from Michael Knott after he goes to talk with a bunch of German elites in February 1979. And he comes back saying the same thing, that basically, the Soviets are trying to codify parity in the strategic nuclear balance in these negotiations, while also locking in their superiority in the European theater. And, you Americans are just not getting it. Narrow American concerns and the failure of US planners to integrate these theater problems, aka the problems that concern the Europeans, into SALT negotiating strategy is letting the Soviets get away with this. And you've got to think about how to redress this theater nuclear balance if you really want to have success with SALT II. And if you don't modernize your TNF forces, in other words, if you don't have some long-range, more modern theater nuclear forces that can engage in coercive nuclear escalation deployed, there's not going to be anything to offer in the arms control negotiations to offset this growing Soviet advantage. And so Nacht is really, sounding the alarm, and he's also conveying the political frustration of the Europeans, just saying, this U.S.-European consultation isn't really working for the Europeans, because it's basically Americans just informing the Europeans of what the Americans are going to do. So there's a lot of frustration, particularly among German elites. So clearly from these documents, you can see the U.S. wanted one thing, the Allies wanted something else. What happens, and why does it happen? Again, just as a reminder, the conventional wisdom that comes out of a lot of research on alliances would say what should have happened is the US would get its way, because the US was the 800-pound gorilla. It was the leader of NATO and the most powerful state, but yet that's not what happens. The dual track decision, as I've previewed, really reflects what the Europeans wanted, contra the wishes of the Carter administration. By the time 1979 rolls around, the Carter administration moves to the position of the Allies. And the explanation to us, we think, is really one about those cohesion concerns that I mentioned, and the fact that they gave the Allies some unusual leverage. What happened over the course of 77, 78, 79 is, as the Europeans continued to grow more panicked, more anxious about the potential course of strategic arms reductions and the lack of theater modernization by NATO, is they started to have a lot more doubts about the alliance's military viability, its ability to coordinate military policy, in other words, its political unity, whether the alliance could actually hang together politically and not have defections or states becoming more neutral with respect to the Soviet Union, and also therefore its external credibility to the Soviets. And all of these doubts, spiraling doubts, really started to undermine the cohesion of the alliance, raise the risk that the alliance would fracture, maybe no longer even serve the US goals for which the alliance had been formed in the first place. And so in the face of all of this, the US ultimately concedes to Allied preferences on military strategy. And it says, fine, we're going to pursue arms control, but we're also simultaneously going to deploy a new class of theater nuclear forces on European soil that can conduct deep strikes into Soviet territory. And we see in the documents that advanced this decision in 1979, you can see one here from Vance and Brown to Carter, and it also reflects to a large degree the views of Brzezinski, that this concern about alliance fracture definitely is in the mix. And they note that, a situation in which NATO does not have missiles on the continent of Europe that could actually strike Soviet territory has political and military significance. And the US needs to take the step of deploying new long-range nuclear systems on the European continent in order to shore up the perception of a firm US commitment, make it clear that the US is not leaving the allies behind in the pursuit of strategic arms control, forge alliance unity, and strengthen deterrence in part by providing credible escalation options and providing a tool by which the Europeans can credibly threaten escalation below the strategic nuclear threshold. So that logic comes through pretty clearly, as does kind of the political concern that if we don't do this new deployment, if we just stand aside from our leadership role and we don't do anything to ease European doubts about our political will and our commitment to their security, then this problem is going to get worse. It's going to weaken NATO, and we could ultimately end up with a Western Europe that's more independent of the United States. It's not like Western Europe's going to defect and go over to the Soviet side, but they could be more neutral. And in particular, that concern echoes something that Nacht had mentioned in his memo earlier that year, which I think was the real concern for a lot of the Carter administration decision makers, which is that if we don't deal with this problem of the theater nuclear imbalance, eventually it's going to create problems for us with West Germany, that Germany would avoid supporting the US in a crisis for fear of alienating the Soviet Union. And it could be the beginning of what he characterizes in this memo as a German drift toward neutralism, AKA, the Germans could actually kind of go over to the other side, or at least have so much autonomy that they weren't on our side. And this really, really freaks out the Carter administration. And so this is what galvanizes them to do the dual track decision against their initial set of preferences. So we've laid out for you, I hope, kind of what the evidence shows about how the dual track decision came about, that this was not, the US charging ahead, doing what it wanted to do, and the allies following behind. It was really the US becoming concerned that what it wanted to do was going to leave the allies behind, and that if the US did that, it was going to fracture the alliance, to the point that the US actually reversed quite dramatically from what its initial set of preferences were with respect to deploying new theater nuclear forces in Europe. So what does this mean? So what? Like, why do we, what's the point of looking at this dual track decision? It was a long time ago. What can we learn from this? Well, we think there's some important implications that we can draw out of this episode for theory and policy, and that it's worth drawing them out because this really is an episode of alliance bargaining in the nuclear shadow that has some potential connections to the world we find ourselves in today. So just as a reminder, the question we started out with is, what connection is there, if any, between asymmetric alliance commitments and escalation risk? And if there is a connection, when does it arise? Through what mechanisms? What's actually going on? And the finding that comes out of this important episode in 1979, we think, is that asymmetric alliance commitments, contra a lot of what the literature would suggest, actually can increase escalation risk, including nuclear escalatory risk. I mean, this is how you get these theater nuclear forces deployed that are designed, quite explicitly to be able to make more credible threats of early coercive nuclear escalation. And the basic story that we think is going on here is that there is preference divergence within the alliance regarding military policy, for some reasons we'll talk about. There's intra-alliance preference divergence regarding military policy. Those divergences become severe and salient enough over time, and there is an over time here story, remember, because this is not something that fell out of the sky. This is coming on the heels for NATO of 20 years or more of bargaining over this question. This set of divergences stimulates concern about cohesion within the alliance, worries that the disagreement over military policy is so severe that it's undermining the alliance's political coordination, its military coordination, its credibility toward the Soviets, to the point where the alliance may actually fall apart and not advance the US foreign policy interests for which it was formed, which leads the US to accede to its smaller allies' preferences, namely the preference to adopt more escalatory military policies and deploy these new theater nuclear forces, which does solve, at least for a time, the alliance cohesion problem, but brings with it, again, by design, feature, not a bug, a heightened risk of nuclear escalation in the event that a war with the Soviet Union had actually broken out. The Europeans would have had this ability to launch from their soil long-range theater nuclear forces that could have very early in a conflict threatened important targets within the Soviet homeland. And that was something new. So there was a heightened risk of escalation that we think resulted from this military policy. And just to delve into a little bit more detail about what we think was going on here, because thinking about this in a generalizable way gives us a tool for thinking about the present and the future. We often think about alliances as countries that, have common interests and shared threats and so forth, and all of that's true. But the reality is allies also have a lot of differences of view, and their preferences on military policy can diverge, particularly when geography exposes them differentially to the costs of war. It's almost always the case in asymmetric alliances that this is the case. And in fact, differential exposure to some adversary is often the reason that an asymmetric alliance is formed in the first place. But being closer to the threat against which the alliance is formed has some really different implications for what states' preferences on military policy might be. In particular, one thing that jumps out from this case is that more exposed, i.e. more geographically proximate, weaker alliance partners may prefer policies that have a heightened risk of nuclear escalation as compared to a distant great power. And this is for a few reasons. One is, these states have really strong incentives to heighten escalatory risk in the event that war happens as a means of bolstering peacetime deterrence, bolstering general deterrence. Because even a conventional war, in some cases for these states that are, would be right in the crosshairs of the enemy, may not be very big, powerful, populous states, even a conventional war for them would be really devastating. So they have strong incentives to gamble on escalatory military policies, even policies that threaten nuclear escalation as a means of preventing the war from ever happening in the first place. They may be more willing to run that risk, since even a conventional war would be really, really bad for them. If a war does happen, they have really strong incentives to try to end the war quickly through nuclear coercion for the same sorts of reasons, right? Like if you're a country that doesn't have a lot of strategic depth, doesn't have a big population, you have strong incentives to want to be able to wield coercive nuclear threats if a war breaks out as a means of trying to get that war to end quickly. Fighting a long, grinding conventional war isn't really a great option for you. And there are also strong incentives potentially for this type of state to want to expand the geographic scope of the war away from their territory. So, if your expectation in a long, grinding conventional war is that that's going to be fought on your territory near your economic and population centers, again, that gives you some incentives to want to take the fight to the other guy's territory as soon as you can. And coercive nuclear threats are a way of doing that. So for all of these reasons, it's not surprising just logically that more exposed, weaker partners may, other things being equal, have a greater preference for policies that threaten nuclear escalation. And of course, conversely, less exposed, stronger partners, AKA the US in this situation, tend to prefer policies that enable conventional defense for as long as possible. And again, differential exposure to the cost of war is part of the reason why. If you're geographically distant from the adversary, then really the only thing that can make the war touch your homeland is if the war turns nuclear. So you have every incentive in the world to try to keep the war conventional as long as possible, because of course that conventional war is not going to be fought on your territory. It's going to be fought I hate to say it, on allied territory, most likely, or adversary territory. And so again, just other things being equal, it's not surprising that there would be preference divergence on military policy, and specifically on the question of how much escalation risk states should take in formulating their military policy. And, this is all fine and dandy, except for the fact that over time, if these intra-alliance disagreements over military policy become severe enough, they can hinder the political and military cohesion of the alliance itself, including the pursuit of the foreign policy objectives for which the great power formed the alliance. It can actually change great power expectations about the value of the alliance, and same for the weaker alliance members, right? It can start to make, if not defection, a position of neutrality or the pursuit of greater autonomy from the great power start to look better if you think that actually when the war comes, the great power is not going to defend you at all. And so it changes the whole calculation on the part of the alliance members about what they're actually doing in the alliance. And over time, that can actually endow weaker partners with leverage to try to get what they want within the alliance and steer military policy in a direction that serves their preferences. And so that's kind of what we see, what we think is going on in this instance from the dual track case, where the stronger partner ends up conceding to its allies' more escalatory preferences. So that's kind of the general argument. I'm just showing you this slide again about how we think you get to a heightened likelihood of escalation in the context of these asymmetric alliance commitments. Now, what does this all mean for the future? We've been talking about the past. What happens if we go back to the future and start thinking about the context in which we began this presentation, which was thinking about US extended deterrence commitments today, and particularly the implications for Asia. And this, as you might guess, is a lot of our real motivation for looking at this project, trying to mine the past to think about the present and the future. And I hope we can discuss this, in Q&A. But we'll pull out what we see as some of the implications for US policy today with respect to Asia in particular. The most obvious one is that what we would call intra-alliance preference divergences on military policy, we think are still really likely today in Asia in the context of US alliance commitments there. And we use the term alliance broadly, to mean a country with which the United States coordinates its military and political policies. And there's obviously many different forms that can take. But the key thing to note is, US friends in this region are all obviously, by dint of geography, exposed much more directly to the threat posed by China, as well on the Korean Peninsula, the threat posed by North Korea to the Republic of Korea. So just by dint of geography and kind of looking at where these countries are versus where the US is, you would expect, if our argument is right, for there to actually be significant preference divergences on military policy. Like, everybody may want to deal with these threats, but they may not want to deal with them in the same way as the United States, because what happens to them in the event of a crisis or war is potentially quite different from what happens to the US. And specifically, we might expect that allies, when there are disagreements, may tilt in the direction of favoring more escalatory policy, especially as the threats that they face from either North Korea or from China, continue to increase as North Korea's nuclear arsenal improves, as China improves not only conventionally, but continues to pursue nuclear modernization, including the pursuit of what appear to be emerging theater nuclear capabilities. All of this is likely to activate the sorts of logics that we saw allies thinking through during the dual track episode. If we think about, for instance, what sorts of policies Japan and Taiwan might favor in the event of threats from China, we often hear, in the U.S. context, advocates for kind of more hands-off policies versus China, policies that would be purely defensive in a war versus China, things like offshore blockade, distant blockade, and so forth. That's all well and good if you're the United States and you can stay outside the blockade. But what about allies like Japan and Taiwan that are likely to be pummeled by Chinese short-range ballistic missiles, throughout whatever the long period of this more defensive U.S. campaign is going to be. Those allies are probably going to urge the U.S. to go find those mobile missiles within China and get rid of them as quickly as possible, which may solve their security problem, but also poses escalatory risks, as a number of scholars, including me, have written about. So there's that possibility with respect to China. There's some similar dynamics that could emerge with respect to North Korea, where if it looks like a major military conflict is going to break out on the Korean Peninsula, you could expect to see perhaps pressure from South Korea to really engage in aggressive counterforce against North Korean targets early and often, right? For the same sorts of logic. South Korea does not want to, get chewed up in a grinding conventional war, and wants to find a way probably to win that. Any war that does break out early through coercive nuclear threats, right? Same sort of dynamic that we saw in the Cold War. Again, other things being equal, you would expect these allies probably to favor these policies more than the United States, which can remain relatively distant from the conflict. And it's true that these policies may strengthen deterrence. That's what they're designed to do, precisely by raising risks of escalation. But they do make it more likely that if a conflict breaks out, that there could be escalation. And that risk is going to be higher as compared to purely defensive responses to Chinese or North Korean actions, or more restrained, more distant, more hands-off military policies that avoid, for instance, attacking critical targets in the adversary homeland. So again, you see the potential for preference divergences between the great power and its smaller allies who are more exposed to the immediate threat posed by the adversary. We also think that there's some implications for the way arms control may play out in the coming years. Again, we often hear arms control, at least publicly thought of as, it's stabilizing, it's great, it brings peace, it, solves problems and so forth. And that's certainly something that it can do. But we also could expect it to perhaps provoke some anxiety among allies. We know in the previous administration, there was a major effort, for instance, to get China to engage with the United States and Russia in the strategic arms control process with New START. It didn't meet with a ton of success, but there's been an effort, as we saw, even in that kind of interim guidance from the Biden administration, to try to re-engage on this process. And I think we should just keep an eye out for the fact that if there actually is a successful pursuit of strategic arms control, an actual cap on strategic weapons that threaten the United States without accompanying limits on theater weapons that can range allies, we may again see some similar dynamics to what we saw in the Cold War, where this actually makes the allies, ask the question, what about us? What, as you're negotiating parity, or at least a deeper state of mutual vulnerability with China, where does that lead us? And, you can make the same observation with respect to debates over adoption of no first use. Biden historically has, I think, looked kind of favorably on the no first use ideas. There's discussion about the administration possibly, reviewing U.S. declaratory policy, maybe considering a sole purpose formulation, all of which, again, has potential benefits, but from the perspective of allies may not be especially welcome, because it may look like an effort to constrain U.S. extended deterrence. And that's, again, a dynamic that we saw in the dual track case. And the question, of course, is what would the allies do about this? Do they have other options? And I think in some cases, maybe they do. They have the option of more autonomy, or simply being more neutral. Certainly, Japan has the capability perhaps to, develop its own latent nuclear capabilities. It's in the process of developing long-range conventional strike missiles, which of course someday could carry nuclear warheads, right? So allies may kind of implicitly make the threat, if you don't protect us, we'll have to protect ourselves. Or if you take away certain types of protections that we think that we have now from U.S. strategic forces, you're going to have to do something else to reassure us. You're going to have to give us some type of other side payment, a tighter security pact that more explicitly specifies the circumstances under which you would intervene on our behalf. You're going to have to additionally, deploy additional forces forward, maybe conventional, maybe additional nuclear forces in the region, in theater perhaps, or maybe even engage in nuclear sharing to reassure us that we do have the ability to maintain deterrence against nuclear threats against us. Those are all things, again, that are kind of reminiscent of the Cold War that we think you could see again. And again, those may solve the deterrence problem, solve the alliance reassurance problem, but they potentially have the ability to also tilt U.S. military policies in a more escalatory direction, which is kind of a familiar problem from a close look at the dual track case. And I think the larger punchline, and the one we'll just end on here before opening up to discussion, is that ultimately, even in these asymmetric alliances, so-called asymmetric alliances, where one country is by definition much more powerful than the other members of the alliance, it doesn't necessarily mean that country, gets everything that it wants and that all good things go together. There actually are some potential trade-offs that have to be made in grand strategy here, where if the U.S. does want to pursue grand strategies that are premised on these continuing alliance relationships, even in the context of growing conventional and nuclear threats from adversaries, it may have to be willing to accept greater escalation risk, or conversely, if it really wants to tamp down escalation risks, really wants to reduce nuclear dangers, vigorously pursue arms control, it may have to think about what sorts of alliance tensions or fractures it might be willing to tolerate in order to get there, because all good things may not go together in these cases. So I will stop there. I think we're at time, and I will put away the slides, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you.